everyone's waiting for this counteroffensive, which Ukraine is supposed to start soon. They want to reclaim all this territory. And I think there was concern that the Chinese were going to try to get in the middle of this and push for this immediate ceasefire that would kind of block the Ukrainians from successfully regaining those lands.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. Today we're talking to the global security editor of Semafor, Jay Solomon. Jay is a former chief foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. He is also a former fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Jay, good to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time today. And we're talking to you because we want to understand a little bit more about China's influence over the war in Ukraine, and more specifically about the accusations that are being made by Ukraine about China's contribution to weapons that are being used by Russia against it. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, China officially is neutral in the conflict, but there's been particularly the Ukrainians have fixated on the surge of semiconductors from China and Hong Kong since the war started in February of 2022. They sort of the Ukrainian military forensically studies the weapons they either capture or destroy on the battlefield in Ukraine. And they've seen this kind of growth of Chinese-made semiconductors and things from drones, cruise missiles, other types of surveillance equipment. So it's become a real issue for them as the US and Europe has really brought down any sort of electronic sales to Russia. The Chinese have really stepped in. So the Chinese are kind of playing a double game. On the one hand, officially they're neutral or say they're trying to broker an end to the war. On the other hand, they're essentially assisting the Russian war machine by allowing these electronics to be sold.
And just how credible do you believe this evidence that Ukraine claims to be collecting to be?
I mean, there are two fronts. There's actually Chinese trade data that's collected that shows this big kind of surge in exports. So I think there's no doubt that, it's very quantifiable. You can see American and European technology exports going down, Chinese and Hong Kong going up. They're capturing stuff in the battlefild. They share what they've seen. They still do see American and European chips in these products as well. Some as, a layover from what was sold in the past. There's also a concern that the countries, particularly the former Soviet states like Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan and countries like that are sort of allowing a transshipment of technology. They're sort of importing it, thinking it's for these countries, and then it gets re-exported to Russia. So there still is Western technology, but they're seeing more Chinese chips coming in as well. They're not seeing weapons, but they're seeing electronics and what's called dual use technology.
Can you give us an idea of the scale of the Chinese contribution to this weaponry in Ukraine?
They're saying, as of last week, the Ukrainian military was saying about 15% of the electronics in these, whether it's drones, missiles, are from China or Hong Kong, which is still not as much as Western technology, because I think there's still a layover, but it's kind of the trend line that it's going up. The U.S. has very publicly warned the Chinese against shipping outright weapons, whether it be rifles or missiles or stuff like that, and that has not happened. But it's the semiconductors, the electronics that are being used in the weapons that the Russians do have, where they see this Chinese presence.
The US is placing sanctions on the supply of these semiconductors to Russia. It's banned 9 specific areas. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
I mean, it's really technical, but it's basically semiconductors and other equipment that are used to help the guidance systems of drones, the guidance system of missiles. They're also seeing this equipment, to be honest, in Iranian-supplied drones, which is also a big issue now because the U.S. has seen, and the Iranians have kind of admitted that they're selling their own kamikaze drones to the Russians. So yeah, it really is 9 types of equipment. It's largely semiconductors, also stuff involved in radars. It's weird. Some of the stuff isn't that sophisticated, to be honest. It can be found in washing machines or things like that can be repurposed for use in military. But both the U.S., the British, and the EU have been very sort of concerted now. They're sending emissaries to all these former Soviet states. They're sending them even to countries like Germany or Italy that don't necessarily understand how their exports to countries that are not Russia are getting re-exported into Russia, particularly a focus, as I said, on these former Soviet states or on the periphery of Russia.
The US is also putting pressure on other countries, the countries that are exporting, who may be doing it without even knowing that they are exporting it. They're ending up in these weapons in Russia. How has that pressure impacted on Russia? Are we seeing any difference yet?
I mean, I think there is, like, you can look at the trade data. There is a drastic, shrinkage of Western technology, which is then being picked up by the Chinese. Which, I mean, the Europeans and the Americans are pretty confident that Western technology is just superior to what the Chinese are exporting. But there's you can see pretty clearly this shift. But yeah, there is these countries in the middle, countries that were either former Soviet states or very much embedded in the Russian periphery. I mentioned Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. There is the concern that Western products are being sold to these countries, and they're either re-exporting it or potentially Russians are setting up front companies in these countries, as a cover to buy this stuff and then exporting it back into Russia. And that's something both the U.S. Treasury, the European Union, and the British Finance Ministry have been really, sending, like I said, these emissaries to these countries saying, you got to watch this. U.S. sanctions are very powerful. It's not just that the U.S. can sanction Russia; they can sanction countries that are breaking our sanctions, i.e., Kazakh, Uzbek companies can get sanctioned for playing this intermediary role.
Sanctions are there, but very hard to impose.
Yeah, but it's basically the way it's framed is like you can do business with Russia, which is a shrinking small economy, or you can do business with the West in dollars, and you make that choice. But if you decide to keep doing business with Russia, you risk access to Western markets, to the dollar, and that's actually pretty powerful. Most trade today is still done in dollars. It still is the global currency. So you risk that if you're caught doing business with the Russians.
And how does this sort of fight over the global semiconductor business between the US and China fit into their geopolitical ambitions?
Well, it's not just regarding Russia. The Biden administration has been very focused of trying to limit Chinese access to advanced semiconductors because they say, the way the Chinese system is set up, there's no real difference between private industry and the military. So you're right. There is this kind of broader battle over the control of semiconductors, a really advanced one. The Chinese are basically trying to create an alternative system where they can produce this stuff, by themselves. They don't need Western technology, but they're not there yet. So there really is a push to deny it. And that's where Taiwan is so interesting, because Taiwan is the most sophisticated, large producer of semiconductors. And if there was a war, the Chinese could conceivably control that, those semiconductor fabs, production sites inside Taiwan. So you're right to describe it really much as a battle for chips, battle over that technology.
And how does that fit into when you're assessing the threat, the global threats that we're facing at the moment?
I mean, it really is weighed in now in U.S. calculations. I think both U.S. and Europe, certainly since COVID, in a lot of ways, since the war in Ukraine, this redirection of supply chains, whether it's for medical services, chips, other types of technology, batteries for cars. There's almost a splitting in these two different camps now between the U.S. and Europe in some ways, and Russia and China, and it's a difficult battle because the U.S. does not have the capacity that it once had, and they're trying to rebuild it. But the war in Russia, I think, is really accelerating it.
And when you look specifically at the situation and China's position over the war in Ukraine, on the one hand, it is accused of supplying these conductors to Russia for its weapons. On the other hand, it's trying to keep Ukraine happy because it has large investments in its infrastructure there, and Ukraine is the most significant foreign exporter to them. I mean, how does it play this?
China, it's been interesting to watch. When the war started, the Chinese, I think the U.S. really tried to position or paint the Chinese as essentially being privy to it, that they had advanced knowledge that Putin was going in. They deny that. And they've been constantly warning that the Chinese are about to start arming the Russians, which the Chinese have denied. I think the Chinese are playing a more sophisticated game. I think they did realize that this war, particularly because it's kind of been botched and it's prolonged, risked their relationship with Europe. So I think that's why you see a really aggressive move now by the Chinese. They put out a 12-point plan in February about how to end the war. They've positioned the special envoy on Eurasia to try to broker some sort of peace agreement. He was in a bunch of European countries earlier this month, including Ukraine, and then he went to Russia itself. So they're trying to regain the initiative, as you will. They're trying to paint themselves as a neutral player that they can help end the conflict. And it comes on the back of them brokering a normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which really caught the West off guard, because that usually is an area where the U.S. really is the leader, and the Chinese kind of snuck in there and brokered this deal. So they are trying to regain the initiative in Europe by pushing this kind of nebulous peace plan.
And how do you, nebulous peace plan, as you say, how do you believe that Russia and Ukraine view China as a potential peace broker?
I mean, I think the Russians probably still look at China sort of as protecting them diplomatically. This peace plan does not call for Russia to give back the territories it's claimed. It more kind of directly says that there should be immediate ceasefire, which I think the Ukrainians and the Westerners like, an immediate ceasefire could allow Russia to essentially, cobble together what they've already claimed and basically permanently control those territories. So the plan itself that initially came out, I think there was a bit of skepticism to it because it was seen as kind of a little bit pro-Russia, or it wasn't pushing for any coercive elements on Russia to stop the war. But I do think, the longer this drags on, and the longer it seems as there being some sort of stalemate, you could see, certainly non-European countries like South Africa and Brazil, for example. Lula in Brazil has been very sort of kind of supportive of the Chinese position, saying, we need a ceasefire now. So the longer this drags on, I think China, because like, as you mentioned, they do have pretty good relations with Ukraine. They have very good relations with Russia. They could emerge as one player that can sort of talk to both sides, similarly to what they did with Saudi Arabia and Iran. The U.S. has good relations with Saudi Arabia. It does not have relations with Iran. So the more, at first, I think it looked as kind of ridiculous, but as the longer this plays out, the Chinese could kind of merge in there. And even the U.S. in recent weeks has said, China could potentially play a role because of this relationship with both Kyiv and Moscow.
So you think they can actually bring both sides of the table and bring about some kind of agreement?
I mean, I think it depends where the war goes. I mean, everyone's waiting for this counteroffensive, which Ukraine is supposed to start soon. They want to reclaim all this territory, and I think there was concern that the Chinese were going to try to get in the middle of this and push for this immediate ceasefire that would kind of block the Ukrainians from successfully regaining those lands. There was a story in the Wall Street Journal today about the Ukrainians talking about a peace summit on their terms, not immediate ceasefire where the lands could be basically ceded to Russia, but a peace summit based still on their policy that we're going to reclaim everything. But if this counteroffensive stalls, it doesn't really go anywhere. It looks like this war is just going to keep grinding on. I do think even in Europe, there could be fatigue. And in that environment, the one country that does have the ability to talk to both Putin and Zelensky is China.
You said earlier that China is neutral in this war. What do you think China wants to ultimately achieve for itself?
I think China is, on the one hand, they have a very close strategic partnership with Russia. They look at sort of everything, as the U.S. does itself, as a kind of global competition against U.S. power. So I think, first of all, they do not want to see Russia humiliated. I think they want to see Putin remain in power and potentially, strengthened or at least not weakened. So I think that's one priority. They look at it as well through the lens of Taiwan. I think if they saw a move by Russia against Taiwan, against Ukraine, that was not only beaten back, but that the global community kind of unified against Russia. That would be a kind of a dangerous sign, or a sign if they actually decided to go and try to reclaim Taiwan, that they could face this similar unified Western position on Taiwan. So I think they look at what's going on in Russia both through the lens of their global competition with Taiwan. I'm sorry, global competition with the U.S. And if they can sort of sneak in there like they did in the Middle East and become an arbiter on the diplomatic front, that would be very good for them in the global battle. And if the lens of Taiwan, if they could, basically help Putin not be humiliated, or could somehow crack the global consensus on Ukraine, they could also potentially do that on Taiwan. So I think they really look at it through those two lenses, Taiwan and the global competition with the US.
It's been suggested that over the war in Ukraine, there is a much bigger picture, that there is also a battle going on for global opinion. How is China exploiting that?
Yeah, I think there really is. Countries like Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, India have not rallied around the U.S. European hardline position. They've a lot of them have had historically good relations with the Soviet Union per se, and I think China knows that there's a much bigger PR communications battle going on, and that they can really exploit that, particularly by pushing a peace plan that, if you're a third country, you might see this as kind of really rational. Like, why wouldn't you want an immediate ceasefire? Why wouldn't you want to stop hostilities right now? And I think the Chinese are also playing that, trying to portray the U.S. as sort of more belligerent, more hostile. Here's China trying to position itself and saying, why not have a ceasefire right now? I think they could get traction on that in countries in the so-called global South outside Europe that aren't as directly impacted by the conflict.
Jay Solomon from Semafor, really good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer, and to you for watching.